Meredith's going to go first.
Okay, cool. Lisa. That's her name. Did you have fun?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our series of presentations designed to help Kansas companies expand their exports. Today, we will focus on free trade agreements and export documentation. My name is Jeff Willis, and I am the director of the International Division here at the Kansas Department of Commerce. I'll be your MC for today's event. This session will be recorded and will be accessible via our website once it has been posted. We look forward to any questions you may have, so please don't hesitate to post them at any time in the chat box. Towards the end of the program, we will go over your questions and hopefully have some good answers for you. So again, don't hesitate to pose your questions at any time in the chat box. For our first speaker today, we are particularly fortunate to have Meredith Bond, the director of the U.S. Commercial Service's Omaha office, which is a federal agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Meredith has appeared before on one of our previous webinars, and we decided to invite her back, given her demonstrated command of the subject matter for today's presentation. In her capacity as director of the U.S. Commercial Service's Omaha office, Meredith works with clients across Nebraska and southwest Iowa to develop international marketing strategies, locate overseas business contacts, and solve export process problems. She also collaborates with local trade development organizations and commercial service colleagues worldwide to provide customized solutions for U.S. companies. Of particular interest today is that Meredith also serves as a nationwide resource to colleagues and clients in the area of free trade agreements. Well, we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to pass the platform over to Meredith. Meredith, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to the Kansas Department of Commerce. Good morning, everyone. I am going to give you the briefest, complete overview of probably your burning questions on free trade agreements. So let's get to it. All right. So as I said, this is really the basics. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions, but I'm going to share some resources where you can also go to see those. Just to get a quick overview, this is where we have free trade agreements. These are the countries around the world. There are a couple of different kinds that we'll talk about, but probably the one most companies are always familiar with is USMCA, which used to be NAFTA. Not a whole lot has changed with it for most companies. So if you were familiar with NAFTA, USMCA is going to be very familiar. So why do companies even do this? How do you get the reduced tariff benefit of an FTA? That is the main reason that companies usually want to qualify their products for an FTA. You've got to make sure that what you're shipping qualifies under the rules of the free trade agreement that we have with that country. You've got to let your customer know, hey, I've done all the homework and they qualify. So we'll talk about how you do that. What is qualifying? Something to keep in mind, you'll hear me mention more than once. Just because a product is shipped from the US or made in the US doesn't automatically mean that it qualifies for the free trade agreement and the probably zero tariffs. The rules vary. But what they all have in common is that you're proving some kind of value added content from probably within the United States if your manufacturing is here, or maybe within a larger FTA territory mix. So why do you have to go through this? It is to ensure that all the benefits of this agreement that we took so much time to negotiate and publish is enjoyed by US companies and the partner country companies, and that some third country can't just kind of ship their goods through, not really add any value in those countries and get the benefits of it. So that's why you've got to do the homework to prove it. So why does it matter? The burden of proof is going to be on the exporter. So if you're the manufacturer and or the exporter, the burden of proof is on you. It's going to be claimed by the importer, who might be your customer, but you've got to provide them that information. You're the only one really in a position to do that. So you need to understand what you're declaring, because you can be audited by that foreign customs service. They do have the right to do that. It doesn't happen a lot. Chances are they might just question it or maybe reject a shipment if they don't like it, but they can come back and audit several years of your shipments. So what if you go through this process and it turns out your product does not qualify under the rules? Can you still send it? Yes, of course you can, but you can't claim that preference under the FTA. So instead of paying 0 tariffs going in, you might have to pay 3% or 10% or whatever it is. But you can always still send it, and you can send along things that aren't made in the US that might not qualify. But you could only claim the preference on the things that you've done the homework for that do qualify for the FTA. So what do you need to establish this proof of origin? You're going to need to know your rule of origin. Before that, you're going to need to know your harmonized system number, and we're going to talk about that quickly. Your HS classification, because that's going to determine what the rule is probably. You're going to need to know a rough bill of materials of what goes into your product. How do you make it? Where do you get those things from? And for all of this, it's going to take some patience and some time. It's not something where a customer can give you a call and say, hey, I need this certificate, and you just, print it out and sign it and it's done. If you've not done the homework previously, it's going to take some time to work with other folks in your company to find that information. So I'm going to make a big assumption here. Let's assume that you know and have the correct HS classification for your product. That's really where you need to start. That's important for a lot of different reasons, but it's especially important when it comes to free trade agreements. So let's assume you've done that all correctly and figured it out, and you have your HS number. So let's talk about the structure of an HS number, because you're going to hear this language in some of the rules. Chapter is the first 2 digits, heading is the first 4 digits, and subheading is the 6-digit level. That's the harmonized part of the HS classification system. That's what we agree on with other countries around the world who use this system, and that's almost all of our trading partners. There are 2 more levels, the tariff item and the statistical level, but you won't see that kind of vocabulary in any of the rules of origin. Couple other background things: origin versus originating. A country of origin is where a product takes on its, final form. Where was it made? Where was it manufactured? Where was it assembled? Where did it become what it is? In general, that's, where you make it. So something might be country of origin US, but might not qualify under rules of origin. So there can be a bit of a difference. So that's the difference between country of origin and originating. So originating means you've got to prove that value added production per the rules of the FTA, and you might have a couple of options. Again, just because it's made in the US or made in one of the other FTA partners doesn't necessarily mean that it qualifies. So as I mentioned, there are kind of 2 different kinds of free trade agreements. The one you are probably familiar with and will run into the most often is kind of the one that's on the USMCA model, where you might have a couple of different options to qualify a product. One we'll call Tariff Shift, and we'll walk through an example of that. And the other might be under regional value content. That's where you're figuring out a percentage of your good. The other free trade agreements that we have that kind of fall into the same category Smaller trading partners, but you may see this from time to time, they kind of have a general rule of it's got to be 35, you have to have 35% content of the appraised value or the selling price. We're not going to talk about those quite so much, but it's almost like every product has the same rule of origin. So again, still similar concepts. You're still trying to prove that value add. Where do you find the rules? Once you have your HS number, you have a few different options. You can find them from the U.S. International Trade Commission on their website. You can go to the USTR website. That's the United States Trade Representative office, and that is who negotiates all of our free trade agreements. So once they're put into place and go into effect, you can find them on the USTR website. I usually like that first one, the USITC. They publish the harmonized tariff schedule of the US. It's updated every year. These rules don't change a lot, but occasionally they do. So you'll see there's kind of an explanation there. What I like to do at the beginning of every year is go to the harmonized tariff schedule, go to the chapter page, and then download the general notes. And the general notes section will have all of our free trade agreements and all of the rules of them spelled out. So if there's any change that's come about, it'll be published in that once a year, the new harmonized tariff schedule for that year. The USTR one, that's the final text as it was published way back whenever it went into effect. So those can get outdated. Usually they're the same, but not always. There's a third option. This is actually a really cool site. It's the U.S. International Trade Center. So it's kind of a combined nonprofit group, and you can go into the rules of origin and look at your product for all kinds of different trade agreements, whether it's US based or international. So that's a nice resource if you're trying to look at other FTAs among non-US countries. So let's say you manufacture something in Argentina, can it go to Brazil under Mercosur, something like that. So that's another good resource. So when we look at the rules of origin, there are usually a few different ways that you can qualify. Almost everything that manufactured products look at are going to be those last two, either tariff shift or regional value content. And that's what we're going to spend our time on. But a few other options, wholly of, that's for agricultural commodities, really. You can point to 100% of that corn came out of that field. And that's really, as I said, reserved for kind of agricultural products or commodities, coal, food products, that kind of stuff. Goods purchased from originating materials. If you can document that everything you buy to make your product is already documented as originating, then you could do it that way. You wouldn't have to look any further than that. That's usually pretty tough for manufactured goods when you have a lot of different things going in. Then, as I said, that 35% is for that one group of free trade agreements with substantial transformation. So you've got to have a percentage, and then you've also got to change those ingredients enough to show that you made something new. But we're going to talk about tariff shift and regional value content. So let's dive into a rule. This is a very simple rule and reads a lot like many rules that you will see. So this is for a pretty simple product, just a ring. Only has a couple of things that go into it, and this happens to be the Korea U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And it reads, a change to heading 7113 through 7118 from any heading outside that group. So remember, the heading is the first 4 digits, so that's the level that we're worried about in changing our materials into our finished good, which is the ring. So what does it mean? The materials, and again, we only have 2 here, they have to undergo some kind of a significant change in their classification. And if you're familiar with the harmonized system, you'll know that the earlier chapters tend to be less processed goods. Like a lot of machinery is in chapter 84, so that comes a lot later. Whereas, you know, just raw steel and plastic and commodities are all in the much earlier chapters. So that's what tells the system, hey, you've changed these raw materials a lot into, you know, a highly finished good. So our good here is jewelry, and we know our HS number is 711620. That allowed us to look up our rule. And only 2 materials. We get sapphires from Australia, and we know their classification, and we get some platinum from Canada. We know its classification. I threw in kind of a what if down at the bottom there. We're trying to qualify this for Korea, if you remember. Does it matter that we have FTAs with Australia and Canada? Because we do. The answer is it doesn't matter at all. We might have imported those at 0 tariff because of those free trade agreements, but it doesn't help us in any way qualify for the Korea-US free trade agreement. Okay, so we know how to make this comparison. So what we're going to do is take a look at the materials and the rule. The sapphires are 7103. That is not in that group that we can't have it come from, which is in the rule 7113 through 7118. So that's different. Check mark. That's great. And then the platinum 7110. That is also outside that group. So that's okay. So this ring, even though we imported 100% of the stuff that we use to make it, will qualify for the Korea-US free trade agreement because we really transform these materials into a finished good. So we're getting credit for all of our design and labor through how we change those materials into this very different finished good. So that's a tariff shift one. We didn't have to do any math. We did have to look at some numbers because we had to look at the classifications, but we didn't have to do any math figuring out percentages. So that's a tariff shift. A lot of rules are tariff shift only. You won't even get the option to run regional value content. But if you do, it doesn't make it harder. It just gives you another option. So let's take a look at what that kind of a rule looks like. This happens to be from the US-Peru free trade agreement, and it's for a blender. So as you can see, there's a part A and a part B, and then the part B mentions percentages. So that seems a little complicated, but let's think about them kind of in a general sense. A, that's a tariff shift, just like the ring example. We take all these widgets, they're classified under this particular subheading. We put them through our manufacturing process, and then at the end, we have something new. It's classified under a totally different subheading that is our blender. We could qualify it that way, maybe. That's usually the easiest option to start with. But let's say that doesn't work. You have a second option to qualify this product, and that's regional value content. So a required percentage of the good needs to be originating, and you'll have to do some math. So you'll run it through a formula, and you might have a couple different options. Let's go back actually to that rule. So you can see 35% under the build up method or 45% under the build down method. For most of our FTAs, not including USMCA, that's the language you're going to see for a lot of products, and that's what they're going to call the 2 regional value content methods, build up and build down. So what we'll be doing there is really comparing the value of the materials that we source either in the US or within that little family specific to that FTA, like for CAFTA, it could be within a bunch of different countries that are part of CAFTA. But to benefit, you've got to have content. That might be materials, it might be labor, but both of those will add value and help your product qualify. So it encourages companies to source with other suppliers, both in their country and within this friendly little group of countries that have come together for the FTA. That's what's behind it. So what you'll need to do to run a regional value content classification is, some kind of bill of materials with the unit cost, because we're going to have to figure out where it comes from, what it's worth, and then we're going to compare that to the selling price of the product. Again, patience, it might not be easy to track them all down. Eventually, you're going to build something that looks like this. These are all the components that go into our blender. We might know its HS number, we know its cost, and you may have to figure out its origin, because we're going to go to the formula soon, and we're going to compare originating materials, like maybe the motor and the plastic base are originating, but the jar is not. We're going to compare that to the non-originating, but you're going to build something that looks like this, and you're going to fill in all of it. There, we filled it all in. I just had to click one more time. So some of them are US, some of them are elsewhere, and some of them are totally unknown. But you're going to need to know that if you're running a regional value content percentage. So here we've figured out what's the total cost of parts, the total non-originating, and then we can kind of plug and play all these numbers as we need to, because these are the formulas, and these are the formulas across all the FTAs that use build up and build down. In one, we are comparing AV, which is the selling price, to the value of originating materials. So we're kind of taking credit for all the originating content that's in there. The build down method, which is the same as USMCA's transaction value, which is probably the one you would use. We're taking out the value of the non-originating material. So it's a couple different ways to run it. And really, whichever one is easier for you to do first, that's the one that you do. And if it works, great. If not, try the other one and see if you can get that to work. So that is how you would run those formulas. Now you might say, hey, where do I get credit for that labor? Because we're really just looking at the stuff that goes in, the widgets that we use to make the product. That's going to be reflected in the AV, the selling price, the transaction price of the good. Assuming you price your good to cover your cost of labor, I assume most companies do that, that's where you get credit for the labor that goes in. In USMCA, there's the net cost method. So that's a little bit different, and that's where you might break out labor specifically as a cost. But for most products, for most FTAs, you're going to get that credit for labor through your selling price. Keep in mind, non-originating materials, that's anything that's from outside the FTA family, or if it's unknown. So if you can't prove where it came from, it's non-originating. So let's say you do all this homework and you qualify your product. Congratulations. How do you claim that FTA preference? Again, you assume responsibility for the data, but you've got to let your customer know who's actually going to do the importing. Possibly you're doing it yourself, so you would let your logistics professionals know, yes, it qualifies, and make that claim when you bring it in. But probably you're going to provide that to your importer, your customer, in writing in some way. The burden of proof is on you ultimately, because you're the one in a position to provide that information to your customer, and they may have to provide it to their customs office if they have some questions. So it's good to share that with them. Keep in mind the record keeping is for 5 years, and we're going to talk about that in a minute also. So documenting this is a huge question that we get a lot. Right now, the US does not have any free trade agreements that require a specific certificate format. I know that sounds shocking, but technically that is true. You will probably get certificates from your customer saying, fill this out, and that's okay. You can do it a lot of different ways, but because there is nothing required in any of our FTAs right now for a specific certificate, our customs agency only provides like a sample version that you can use, and you can use that, but it doesn't publish anything like it used to always have the NAFTA certificate of origin that you could download and fill out. So they have like a sample one on their site, but there's no specific format. You will have to provide your customer certain data elements, and we'll mention those, but it's best to check the FTA and go into that rules of origin chapter to make sure you have all those included. Keep in mind, these are self-certifying documents, so someone at your company is going to have to sign this and put their name and their contact information. These are not a generic certificate of origin that you would get from a Chamber of Commerce. We're going to talk about that just a little bit. Those actually have to be signed by an outside entity, either your chamber or the electronic service that they use. This is generally the minimum data elements that most of the FTAs ask for. If you're familiar with the old NAFTA certificate of origin, all of these things are going to look very, very familiar. Who are you? Who are you selling to? Are you the producer? Who's going to be importing it? What's the HS classification? How does it qualify? That's the origin criteria. With NAFTA, that was the letter codes. And you can still use some letter codes if they send you a certificate, but I would spell it out like, hey, I used the regional value content for this rule. So, and if there's a blanket period, and again, you're going to have to authorize it, sign it. Record keeping, 5 years. That's not just your certificate, but all of the information that we talked about that goes into figuring out if the goods qualify. I would highly recommend, especially if you're using regional value content, that you revisit your qualification, because chances are your prices are changing, the cost of your materials are changing, and it's quite possible that running that math formula, it could go back and forth. Sometimes it qualifies, sometimes it doesn't. That's possible, but you certainly want to review it on a regular basis and keep track through some kind of a log sheet when it is reviewed and how often it's done. If it's tariff shift, that changes a lot less frequently, but it probably should still be reviewed on a regular basis. Where can you go for help online? Export.gov doesn't really exist anymore, but you can still get to the tariff tool quickly that way. But trade.gov is our website now, and we have a whole area on free trade agreements about rules of origin, walking you through examples like I just mentioned, kind of definitions and glossaries and other things. So I highly recommend this trade.gov free trade agreements help center. I did help write some of the pages that are on there. Okay, non-FTA certificates of origin. These are the ones that your customer will be like, I need a certificate of origin. And let's say you think, we don't have an FTA with that country. What are you talking about? I think they're talking about the ones that would, in the olden days, you would go to the Chamber of Commerce, they would put their little stamp on it, and you'd provide it to your customer. Very few countries really require that anymore. So I would go back to your customer, make sure they really need it. They could just be asking for it out of habit. You can double check with your freight forwarder. And then you would have to check with your local Chamber of Commerce to see how they do it. There are a couple of online ones that a lot of chambers of commerce subscribe to now. ES-Cert is one of them, and eCertify is another one. So check with your local chamber if you really do need one of those. That is different than your self-certifying FTA one. So that is the super quick overview on free trade agreements. Here's my contact information, and everyone in Kansas. We've got 2 great offices that cover the state of Kansas. My colleague AJ in Wichita covers a whole bunch of Kansas, and then we also have a Kansas City office that certainly covers that metro region. But I'd be happy to figure out who you work with if you don't know them already, but maybe these names already sound familiar. I know Jeff knows them both very well. So I will stop it there and turn it back over. Thank you so much. And I will stick around, so if we have time and you guys have questions at the end, I'll be happy to answer that then. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Meredith. I tell you, there's a reason why we invite you to be able to make this presentation. Nobody else makes a subject matter that can be particularly challenging sometimes so clear-cut and so easily understood. I'm sure our audience is quite appreciative of what you're able to do. So thank you very much again. Our next speakers, Jay Devers and Linda Reynolds, are also well known to this office. Jay is the managing partner of Bestway International, Inc., and is an accomplished business development executive with an entrepreneurial background. Founded in 1988, Bestway is a U.S. customs broker and international freight forwarder, representing Hellman Worldwide Logistics since 2006. In 2017, Bestway International was presented the President's prestigious E Award for Export Service by U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, which is the highest recognition any U.S. company can receive for making a significant contribution to the expansion of U.S. exports. Linda works with Jay in the area of export documentation and regularly helps companies with their freight forwarding and export documentation needs. So with that, I would now like to invite Jay to address our audience.
Jeff, thank you for the introduction. And thanks again to the Kansas Department of Commerce for the invitation to present this morning. That is a tough job following up Meredith. Just to be on the same presentation as her is a tremendous honor. And there's just no one better in this business than Meredith. And I always learn something when I hear from Meredith, and that presentation was no different. So I appreciate that. Linda and I are here to talk a little bit about export documentation. Meredith touched on that just a second ago, but there's a couple of key areas that we'd like to focus on in the limited amount of time that we have for you this morning. Really, this starts getting into the world of compliance. I'm certain that there's some folks on this meeting right now that have some compliance concerns, and if we can't address those in the next few minutes, we certainly are available offline to do that. But what we're going to talk a little bit about today is just the documentation side of things. As Jeff mentioned, we've had the privilege of operating in the export freight forwarding business for almost 34 years now. And so by virtue of that, I've handled a tremendous amount of documents and been involved in a number of compliance related issues. But really kind of focusing on the end of the presentation, the first one, Meredith touched on this, and it's critical. Those documents are necessary to have around. There's several of them that are very important, and regardless of your Incoterm that you're using, as the exporter, you have the obligation to keep those files around for 5 years. So if you come away with nothing else, that's very, very important in this presentation. So that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about the filing of export information and then the 2 or 3 most critical documents that you see in the world of export activity. Really, we look at it quite simply. The 3 big documents are that commercial invoice, packing list, and then your transportation document. That's where we come in. The transportation document is either going to be your ocean bill of lading or most likely your airway bill, possibly a pro number on a truck shipment. But those 3 big documents are going to be the commercial invoice and packing list on the shipper side, and then your forwarder prepared transportation document. Meredith touched on the HS code, very critical. There are certainly some people involved here that have ECCN classification procedures. The U.S. principal party of interest is information that you'll need to know. And then obviously you are to some degree, you need to know exactly what it is that you're shipping. So Meredith talks about the HS number, and we'll hit on that very, very briefly. That is your 6 to 10 digit number, and really kind of triggers the world of dutying and understanding on both sides of a transaction what it is that's trading places. Won't spend any time on the breakdown of the HTS code, but the Schedule B is essentially the one that we want to focus on as it relates to the export compliance side of things. ECCN is your export control classification number. It's an alphanumeric code that essentially defines the article's technology and software that goes into the product that's being exported. I'm going to skip through this. This presentation, which we're happy to share with you, is actually 59 slides. It's very long. Given the time constraints that we have this morning, I'm just going to breeze through a few of these things just so there's a little bit of exposure. But as you can see, the ECCN number is easy to reference, and kind of your fallback reference guide there in our world is the EAR 99 document. USPPI simply is a fancy word for being responsible for who the primary benefactor from an export transaction is. This is almost always the seller, and from a compliance standpoint, this is the party that's focused on as the exporter. I'm going to skip over risk there, and let's get into really the most important parts of the documents. And this goes back to those big 3 that I mentioned a few moments ago. The freight forwarder, the port of export. I'm sorry, I've just got a note from Kat. Is there a problem on the presentation, guys?
Yeah, we don't see it.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah.
apologize.
It was so big, we couldn't load it. Jay. Yeah, so go ahead and try to share again. We can also take charge on this end should you wish. All right, so
Okay.
here it comes.
I apologize there. I was trying to do the presentation and also seeing all the chat messages come through. It looks like something might have been wrong. How about now?
We see it, but we see the non-presentation mode. We just see, there we go.
There we
Everything's
go.
looking good
Okay.
now.
All right, good. I'm a little bit proud of my multitasking there as reading these messages and also trying to do the presentation. So anyway, here's where the freight forwarder partnership is critical. And if you are in a situation where you're not feeling like you're getting value from freight forwarder as it relates to managing documentation, you really might want to examine that relationship, because this is the part of the world where we really do what we're supposed to be doing. And that, and so we're looking at that commercial invoice. It's, you can't really have enough detail on there, but it's also a working document that kind of defines the transaction between you and the customer. But you want to be as specific as possible, where you want to have that port of export there, the destination country, that typically is going to be represented in Incoterms if used properly. And then the mode of transport with the carrier is something that you want in there. When you're talking about that particular document, the value is critical. The consignee obviously is there. Some of the stuff is pretty basic. And then the essentially the value of the shipment is something that is a part of two huge parts of the transaction. One of them is on the export clearance, which is going to be your ACE filing these days. The value, if it's above $2,500, is critical. And then also, if you're using an insurance implied Incoterm, you're going to want to make sure that you have insurance at invoice value plus 10%. You can present an insurance certificate on demand, and also in the event of a loss or damage that they don't claim back through you, they can actually claim against that insurance certificate. So valuation is a very important trigger factor here. I feel like I've got about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to really jump right ahead to ACE. In the world of ACE, and Meredith is far more of an expert on this than I am. Over the course of the last 5 years, the ACE environment has made enormous steps forward. We still, as a freight forwarder, do a fair bit of filing on behalf of our customers, but the operating environment has gotten to the point where there's a lot of exporters that are very comfortable with the ACE environment, as they should be. So it's I think working as it was intentionally designed when it was relaunched here 3 or 4 years ago, and so a lot of progress there in the ACE world. AES, I don't think, Linda, really AES we don't see anymore, do we? That's okay. So I'm going to jump this slide since we don't really have that. AES just doesn't exist much anymore in our world. If you haven't had exposure to the ACE portal, there's a couple of screen grabs in here that kind of give you a look at it. As I mentioned, it's extremely user-friendly, much more so than in the past. And again, this is a freight forwarder value add services, the ACE filing, in case that's not something that you're comfortable with and want to get into that. Again, I mentioned 2,500 is basically the value, and that's the trigger. If you're under 2,500, you don't have to worry about an ACE filing. Let's see here. Really trying to kind of stay on track with timing. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. Skip the AES. Basically, sections in each shipment that you want to have represented in your documentation. Really, a lot of common sense here. I think Meredith touched on this just a little bit ago. When you look at documentation that you need to be compliant with trade agreements and that sort of thing, you just got to be able to say in confidence that you've got the basic details covered and you've got some command and awareness over who is receiving your cargo, what's being shipped, and what the value of that shipment is. Power of attorney, we've essentially gotten to the point, and Linda can attest to this, where we've got the power of attorney documents that are essentially baked into the shipper's letter of instruction. If there's any questions about an SLI, we could certainly take that offline, but over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, we've kind of consolidated those two documents down to one, which has been handy, and it's eliminated time and confusion on behalf of the exporter. So trying to kind of wrap this up quickly. Again, here we're talking about the main 3 documents. Again, if we leave you with nothing else, think about that file that's going to exist in your world for at least 5 years after the shipment. Invoice is critical with as many elements as possible. We see a lot of exporters right now that are reconfiguring their ERP systems to get more and more detailed information about the transaction onto that commercial invoice. The packing list, also this represents the physical side of the transaction. And so we want to know, what is the size, weights, and pieces that we're dealing with, and then that bill of lading, that transportation document, which you get from your freight forwarder. Now, speaking only on behalf of ourselves, we do keep a 5-year filing system in paper on your behalf. So in the event of a compliance breakdown, and I would hope other freight forwarders would do that too, but I can only speak for ourselves. We do have that 5-year file compliance requirement covered on all of our export shipments that we handle. Jeff, I think I'm about out of time. I guess the only thing that I think the packing list and the transportation documents speak for themselves. One area that I'll touch on quickly is the pro forma invoice. In our world, most people are using a pro forma invoice, kind of takes the place of a quote, or in some cases a proposal. And that actually is a acceptable document. But again, the ideal practice here is to try to populate that pro forma invoice with as much detail as possible about the transaction, so it doesn't come off looking like some sort of an informal price quote. Most shippers that we talk to these days just skip that step. I mean, I can't think of a shipper, and Linda I can't think of a shipper that I've seen use a pro forma invoice recently. Most of them have graduated to the commercial invoice. And then we can get into some of the details on that. Certainly can provide this documentation. This is the old rule of thumb that, as much information on that commercial invoice as possible, the better, but certainly the HTS codes, Incoterms, and valuation are critical for the pro forma invoice. Jeff, my phone is telling me that I'm about out of time. I'm going to pop out. Really, no reason to. There's some detail, some slight details around some of the transportation documents and the packing list. Really, it's just a diligence exercise to make sure that those documents have as much detail as possible. And again, one of the things that we're seeing in our world is people going through and adding formality and adding diligence to these documents, so they don't come off as underprepared or oversight type of things. The packing list and the commercial invoice with as many details as you can populate of the international transaction are possible. In other words, let's try to steer away from just using a domestic commercial invoice and domestic packing list for international transactions if we can avoid that. Feeling like I'm about out of time, so Jeff, I think I'll stop right there and open up for questions if interested.
Well, again, thank you, Jay, for your presentation. Clearly, as everyone saw, there's a lot of material that you can take advantage of. And with Jay's background, and Linda certainly by his side, you've got some expertise in the freight forwarding and customs area that will serve you well. As Jay has certainly made clear, there's a lot of very specific information that may be particular to your own circumstance that we welcome any questions you may have relevant to that, because you have expertise here, both in terms of Meredith talking about free trade agreements generally and some of the requirements that are in play, and then of course with Jay and his freight forwarding company and what you need to do to be able to fulfill the export documentation requirements for not just free trade agreements areas, but also generally for export work. And so with that, I haven't seen any particular questions pop up in the chat box. I encourage anybody to do so. I can go ahead and pose one question that came to my mind for you, Meredith. Initially, when you were talking about the build up versus build down methodologies, of course, you said, hey, both are available, and just it's a question as to what might work best for the company as they look to be able to qualify for the free trade agreement. But I'm just kind of curious, in your experience, are there particular strategies that apply to either the build up or the build down methodology, or are there comments you could make generally relative to the percentage of time people might use one strategy over the other, et cetera, et cetera? I'm just kind of curious, while they are both available to be able to make use of, and maybe there are particular circumstances where one makes more sense than another, independent of maybe the ease of deployment, let's say, from a company's perspective. And so if you could kind of drill down a little bit in that area and then give us a little bit more background, I think that might be useful to the audience. So thank you, Meredith.
Sure. I would say in general, tariff shift first, try that. And again, you're not looking at a bill of materials with all their origins and dollar values. You're just looking at those HS numbers. So generally, that's the easiest way to start. Now, if that doesn't work and you have to move on to regional value content, I would say most of the time you're using the build down method, which is the same as USMCA's transaction value method and old NAFTA's transaction value method. The shortcut for that is look at your total cost of materials and plug that into the formula without having figured out what's originating and what's not. Plug that total cost of materials in, and let's say you have huge margins on your product. Because you're comparing it to your sales price, sometimes that's a shortcut and sometimes you qualify anyway. So it doesn't matter where your materials come from. Just because, you know, your selling price is such that even if your cost of materials fluctuates and your suppliers change from originating and non-originating, that's the shortcut for that one. And sometimes that works. So I would say probably the build down method is your next. And if that doesn't work, try the build up method. And again, in USMCA, the other option for regional value content is net cost. That's where you have to figure out your net cost of production. So you're using that number instead of your selling price. It's a little more complicated, so that's usually a not popular option, unless, and USMCA is a bit of a different animal in some things, and the whole reason NAFTA got renegotiated, there are certain industries that they were really looking to insulate a little more. So if you make automotive parts, you're probably already painfully familiar with this. You have to use net cost, and there's all other kinds of things in there. And we have accumulation. That's probably a word a lot of people don't know. But again, on trade.gov and that free trade agreements area, we've kind of got definitions that explain a lot of that stuff. But for most companies, start with tariff shift. If that doesn't work, and regional value content is an option, because it's not an option under every rule, I'd say build down, try that first. And again, try the shortcut where you include all your cost of materials and see if it works.
Wonderful. I knew that that question had some depth to it, so very much appreciate your guidance, Meredith. It's always a question of best practices, isn't it? The ability to sort of work your way through some of these subjects to try to optimize for a particular company's needs. And so with that in mind, I'm kind of curious, as I ask the next question of you, Jay, what what kind of guidance might you present to companies? Obviously, as a freight forwarder, we know that you work very closely with your clients to be able to help them make sure that their export documentation meets the objectives of their transaction, and that they've thought of everything, and if they have a particular question, you can go ahead and help them out with it. But I'm just kind of curious, are there particular problems or issues that you see that have a particular requirement for people to pay attention to that you might be able to give some guidance to as it relates to export documentation generally, and of course, export documentation as it relates to free trade agreements?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a good question. I looked over here at Linda and I'm thinking, how much time do we have to answer that? There's a few. The big one is Incoterms. I probably would be remiss if I didn't say that, just because that's really the big one, is the misunderstanding of Incoterms. But as you dive into the documentation part and export compliance, which I think really kind of go together, some of the things that we've seen in the past that are concerning is, a mistake. Usually it's unintentional as it relates to an export filing, an ACE filing. And almost all the time that's not done on purpose or doesn't have any real malicious intent. But the trouble is something you can get into from a compliance standpoint is once one of those mistakes is found, then they look for the recurrence of it. And almost all of our clients are kind of recurring clients that have very, very regular outbound business. And so if there is a mistake in the process as it relates to the value of a product or a misclassification or misstatement of a port of export, usually by the time it's caught, it's been repeated a few times. And so what we've gotten into in our world is assisting with the mitigation of a compliance concern on behalf of a shipper. Having done this for a while, and Linda's the expert, is we kind of have developed a little bit of a sense for, the punishment and the crime, and then also kind of things you can say and things you can do to really significantly mitigate those concerns. And really, if you think about it, the authorities involved are here to see American companies succeed at exporting, do it properly. And so as long as there's not obvious malicious intent and there's a legitimate focus on correcting the problem, the compliance fines can usually be mitigated down to almost nothing, which is super cool. We like that. But to answer your question, Jeff, Incoterms mistakes, that's kind of like part of the flow of traffic. It's kind of like, a trooper could sit on the side of the highway and not be there very long before somebody comes through 15 miles over the speed limit. That's just kind of how it works. But when you start getting into the documentation, it takes you right to the world of compliance. And then you just got to make sure that the diligence goes into filing things correctly, keeping that file set up correctly, and being able to demonstrate that, you have a serious commitment to doing this the proper way.
Well, thanks a lot, Jay. I could tell the audience that this is the reason why we bring these experts on for webinars like this. The subject matter is really quite large, and there are best practices and, again, experience-derived kinds of understandings that make it so much easier to be able to work with these folks as well as the broader audience or the broader provider audience that's out there, whether it's Josh in Kansas City, as Meredith had indicated, or certainly AJ in Wichita. They're also gateways to expertise, and I know you can reach out to Meredith directly as well, but it's important to note that your freight forwarder, as you've seen from Jay's presentation, is really one of your best allies in understanding what can happen and some of the ways to be able to overcome any challenges you might have. And then lastly, to be able to say, hey, don't worry about this. This may be an issue that arises, but in this instance, everybody's trying to work on your behalf to try to make sure that there is an increase in exports and that export activity proceeds forward in a smooth fashion. And so they're here to be able to help you. We did have a couple of questions that came in through the chat box, and just for the purpose of making sure that everybody gets a chance to see the answers that were provided, I'll read the first question and then the answer that Meredith was able to give to that question. The question came in, is the adjusted value the sum total of the originating and non-originating values? And Meredith came back with, the adjusted value in the formulas is the transaction price, i.e. the selling price of the finished good. And then she goes on to say, if there is no sale, like you're selling to a sister company, there are a few other methods to determine under appraised value, and she gives a particular website link, which should be available to everyone in the chat box as well. And again, thank you very much, Meredith, for that level of detail. I'll again make the call for any other particular questions, and these can be submitted anonymously. So if you have a particular issue at hand, you have before you two representative areas of expertise, both with Meredith in her capacity with U.S. Commercial Service, as well as Jay in terms of his capacity as Bestway International and the freight forwarding background. So with that, I'll make a final call for any questions that folks may have. But if you don't have any particular questions now, hey, we recognize that some of the subjects can be pretty involved and may require further dialogue with our presenters. I know they both welcome any of you to be able to reach out directly to them, and should you have any challenge in doing so, please contact us and we'll put you in touch with them. Additionally, should you wish to review the presentation that was made today, you'll be able to find that as a recording on the Kansas Department of Commerce website. We offer all of our webinars that have appeared over these last several years on the website and can be easily viewed and reviewed at that time. Well, with that, we're getting close to our hour, and again, I don't see any other questions that have come up in the chat box, and so I'd like to thank our presenters for availing themselves for this presentation. It clearly is a subject matter that requires ongoing study, ongoing awareness. And so we really look forward to making sure that any of the Kansas companies who are in attendance today are certain to be able to contact either Meredith or Jay for any further follow-up for this subject. Thanks again to our presenters, and thank you to the audience for attending this event. And we look forward to being able to present an additional webinar to you. We're doing this on a fairly regular basis, pretty much every month, with new subjects that we believe are of interest to Kansas companies. Lastly, if you have any particular subjects that you would like us to address, we're always open to any ideas or thoughts you may have in that area. So with that, I'd like to bring today's webinar to a close and thank everyone for both your attendance and the presenters for their wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you next time.